An environmental issue that's been attracting a lot of attention around the world for the past 3 decades. Something so massive and complex that it's changing the way we look at Earth. Because our future depends on it. Is there an underlying political agenda? And if so, who's involved? Get ready as Edge of Wonder discusses the environmental issue we've all been wondering about. Climate change and global warming. The Edge of Wonder.
Welcome to Edge of Wonder. We're your hosts. I'm Ben.
And I'm Rob. If you thought that climate change was an open and shut case, think again.
Stay tuned, because in this 2-part climate series, we unearth some discoveries that will freeze you in your tracks.
In this first part, we'll break climate change down for you, give you the lay of the land of the two sides of this debate, discuss the causes of climate change, expose how climate models are flawed, and why politicians and the media push this false narrative.
Throughout our research, we were blown away by how much amazing work is already out there. We just wanted to use this video to highlight that good work and connect the dots on recent updates so that this information doesn't get buried in all of the fake science and fake news out there.
Be sure to do some digging on your own if this topic interests you, and feel free to check our sources. We don't claim to be professional scientists, but we are open-minded, logical individuals.
If you find new evidence supporting or refuting what we've surfaced in this video, feel free to comment below. We want to encourage a discussion since we get this topic is sensitive for some people.
One last word from us before you watch the video. We're going to drop a lot of names of scientists and reference some research papers, websites, or videos that we found. If it gets overwhelming, please feel free to rewind.
Yeah. To kick things off, what's climate change? What's global warming? National Geographic and Wired.com both define climate change as long-term shifts in weather and temperature as a result of global warming.
Other mainstream news sources are calling attention to climate change and the increase in temperature.
Surely, if almost everyone, like this piece saying 97% of climate scientists from a 2013 study and environmental research letters agreed that there's a link between global warming and global climate change, and that humans are causing global warming, then it must be true, right?
But hold on a second. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change writes, quote, "Climate change refers to a change in climate state persisting for decades or longer, whether due to natural variability or as a result of human activity," unquote.
So the UN's IPCC, also made up of many groups of scientists, came to a different conclusion, that it could be human activity or nature.
Before we dig deeper, let's look at the origin of these terms. When did the term global warming and climate change get coined?
Well, the term global warming came first before the term climate change. Global warming as a term made its first appearance in a 1975 Science article by geochemist Wallace Broecker of Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Geological Observatory. Climatic change. Are we on the brink of a pronounced global warming?
On NASA's site, it writes about the difference between the terms, climate change and global warming. Industrial emissions of tiny airborne particles called aerosols might cause cooling, while greenhouse gas emissions would cause warming. People then didn't come to a common consensus, so it was just called climate change as a blanket term.
So when did the climate start drastically changing? Mainstream sources will say around 1830 to 1850, which is around the time of the end of the Industrial Revolution.
However, geological history tells us that the Earth has always undergone climate change. There's been past periods of global warming in the East and the West. China's Central Plain under the Shang Dynasty 3,000 years ago was a subtropical region where people hunted elephants.
Quote, "The average annual temperature is estimated to have been around 2 degrees Celsius higher. Citrus was grown on the grounds of the Imperial Palace in Chang'an, situated in northwest China now.
In the 2016 report, Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming, published by the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change, NIPCC, over recent geological time, Earth's temperature has fluctuated naturally between about 4 Celsius and -6 Celsius with respect to 20th century temperature.
In the last 2 million years, it alternated between cold and warm interglacial periods that lasted 15,000 years each. So it hasn't been this lukewarm temperature that it has stayed the same and just skyrocketed after the Industrial Revolution.
What are the two opposing views in the debate of climate change?
There's the anthropogenic global warming view, which claims man has ruined the climate by increasing carbon emissions. The other view is a skeptical one, which doesn't believe that man can be the sole reason behind climate change. The opposing side calls them skeptics, but we like to call them climate change truthers.
The truthers take a more holistic approach and think that there are larger forces at play here, like sun, cosmic rays, water vapor, and cloud cover, the poles shifting, or other ways which we will get into very soon.
Zooming out and looking at these two views, one perspective backs itself into a corner. How can anything be absolute, right? How can we definitely say that climate shift is solely or largely caused by humans?
The Courbet report didn't need to take long to dismantle the brittle, flip-flopping evidence presented by the media. It's so good, we have to share it. Highly recommend that you guys check this out.
To summarize their point, the Courbet report basically shows how the media can't really seem to put a finger on whether climate change is making the world hotter or colder, wetter or drier, malaria-ridden or malaria-free. Both states seem to exist for one geographic area, which is a contradiction.
Philip Scott, Emeritus Professor of Biogeography at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, says climate change is too complicated to be caused by one factor, whether CO2 or clouds.
Professor Scott criticized folks who toss around the term climate change denier or climate skeptic when the reverse is true.
Quote, opponents of global warming are often snidely referred to as climate change deniers. Precisely the opposite is true. Those who question the myth of global warming are passionate believers in climate change. It is the global warmers who deny that climate change is the norm. This guy calls it like he sees it.
Climate change deniers actually believe in climate change and that it's been around forever. Anthropogenic global warming believers think the climate is supposed to be stable.
Professor Ian Clark from University of Ottawa's Department of Earth Sciences said, you can't say that CO2 drives climate. It certainly never did in the past. If we look at climate change from a geological perspective, we would never suspect CO2 as a major climate driver, unquote.
So CO2 levels may have spiked most recently, but there's been warmer spikes in temperature throughout history that didn't correlate with lower CO2 levels in the past.
But the person who cuts through all the crap and gets to the heart of it all is Lord Nigel Lawson of Leicestershire, a former member of British Parliament. He said, there is such an intolerance of any dissenting voice who opposes climate change. This is the most politically incorrect thing possible to doubt this climate change orthodoxy.
This could not be more true. In part 2 of this series, we'll cover how the climate change and environmentalism as a whole has been weaponized by the deep state to divide and conquer the unsuspecting populace.
To catch the second part of this series, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you know when the next part is ready.
Here's a quick excerpt from The Great Global Warming Swindle, which aired on Channel 4 in 2007.
And the global warming alarm is dressed up as science, but it's not science. It's propaganda.
There's no direct evidence which links 20th century global warming to anthropogenic greenhouse gases.
We're just being told lies. That's what it comes down to.
You can't say that CO2 will drive climate. It certainly never did in the past.
If the CO2 increases in the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas, then the temperature will go up. But the ice core record shows exactly the opposite.
Truly wondrous.
It's full of stars.
Now, what have these two sides concluded are the main causes of climate change?
If you ask the media, the environmentalist nonprofit organizations, or certain extreme political people, you would get the answer you were expecting. It's people, the big corporations, and their carbon emissions, hence the term anthropogenic global warming.
That answer seems suspiciously simple. Israeli scientist Nurjay Shaviv has written papers and done presentations explaining how climate is affected by solar radiation and cosmic radiation.
Some of his clearest examples show how changes in sea level align with the 11-year solar cycle, and his work has been peer-reviewed, which means it should be acceptable for use by the IPCC.
But why doesn't the IPCC use his work? Well, Shaviv believes that using his work would mean that the IPCC would have to change their conclusions on what drives climate change, and in particular, how large is climate sensitivity.
Yeah, so anthropogenic global warming only makes sense if it's paired with a high climate sensitivity. High climate sensitivity would mean higher changes in temperatures. However, what we observed in the 20th century only makes sense with a lower climate sensitivity. That means we should expect a small change in temperature in the 21st century. Bam!
Professor Zbigniew Jaworowski, professor of atomic radiation, atmospheric scientist, and mountaineer, has played a pretty large role in all of this debate.
In a signed letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations in 2007, Jaworowski called global warming a natural phenomenon that has affected humanity through the ages. Defined carbon dioxide as a non-polluting gas that is essential to plant photosynthesis.
He also claimed the IPCC's report were quite inadequate as justification for implementing policies that will markedly diminish future prosperity.
This guy does not hold back, and he has the research to back it up. In his 50-year career, he's excavated ice out of 17 glaciers across 6 continents.
In an article published by 21st Century, Jaworowski writes that Earth's climate has more to do with cloud cover and water vapor than CO2 concentration in the atmosphere.
When discussing greenhouse gases, he writes that, quote, the most important among these greenhouse gases is water vapor, which is responsible for about 96 to 99% of greenhouse effect.
Among the other greenhouse gases, CO2, CH4, CFCs, NTOs, and O3s, the most important is CO2, which contributes to only 3% of the total greenhouse effect. The man-made CO2 contribution to this effect may be about 0.05 to 0.25%. CO2 is a tiny percentage of all of the greenhouse gases, and the man-made portion is an even tinier fraction of all of that.
Next, Jaworowski states that the higher level of cosmic radiation in the Earth's troposphere causes greater formation of clouds, which reflects the incoming solar radiation back into space. This results in a cooler climate.
Under the Trump administration, William Happer, current National Security Council technology advisor, has spearheaded an initiative to create a presidential committee on climate. He has stated that the rising carbon dioxide emissions help the planet, not hurt it. Why? Carbon dioxide levels will benefit plant life, including agricultural crops. I mean, which is way different from the narrative.
Right, obviously, mainstream science and mainstream media has pushed back
a lot.
Exactly. However, that doesn't seem to faze him. There's no problem from CO2, Hopper said. The world has lots and lots of problems, but increasing CO2 is not one of the problems.
He continues, so the Paris Agreement dignifies it by getting all these yahoos who don't know a damn thing about climate saying this is a problem and we're going to solve it. All this virtue signaling, you can read about it in the Bible. Pharisees and hypocrites and phonies.
So get this, there's another connection between William Happer and President Donald J. Trump. Happer knew Trump's uncle, John G. Trump, a physicist at MIT, and we talked a lot about him in our previous episodes.
There's proof to back up Happer's claim that CO2 is not a problem and is actually helping the environment.
Wait.
What?
What? Yeah, that's right. The Center for the Study of Carbon Dioxide and Global Change, based out of Arizona, does some really awesome work documenting all sorts of plants exposed to CO2-enriched environments. They've archived thousands of results from hundreds of peer-reviewed research studies conducted by hundreds of researchers.
The overwhelming evidence that they've collected demonstrates how more CO2 in the air increases the productivity of nearly all plants. Plants produce more branches and tillers, more and thicker leaves, more extensive root system, and more flowers and fruit.
Atmospheric CO2 enrichment leads to yield increases of 25% for fruits and melons, 48% for roots and tubers, and 37% for vegetables.
Not only will CO2 enrichment make plants grow faster, larger, and healthier, fruits and vegetables may even be more nutritious and sweeter.
One study shows sugarcane exposed to a CO2-enriched environment had 29% more leaf sugar content than those under ambient or current concentrations.
Another study done on strawberries concluded that elevated CO2 increased the levels of dry matter content, fructose, glucose, total sugar, and sweetness index per dry matter.
Zooming out, NASA also collaborated CO2's positive impact on the environment. Their satellite views show that the globe has actually been greening.
Quote, from a quarter to half of Earth's vegetated lands has shown significant greening over the last 35 years, largely due to rising levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide, according to a new study published in the journal Nature Climate Change on April 25th. This evidence further confirms Happer's statement.
How did these scientists discover this greening? Well, an international team of 32 authors from 24 institutions in 8 countries used satellite data to calculate leaf cover over the world's vegetated regions.
They used NASA's Moderate Resolution Imaging Spectrometer and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Advanced Very High Resolution Radiometer instruments to capture leaf cover or the leaf area index.
Sure, the world is greening, but how much greening is actually happening? Well, they calculated the greening or the increase in leaves on plants and trees to be equivalent in area to 2 times the continental United States.
2 America's worth of plants and tree spread all around the globe over 35 years.
Next, we'll dig into how scientists have arrived at their conclusions in the first place, whether they are in the alarmist camp or whether they're in the truther camp.
Much of the alarmist mainstream media articles point to a consensus from a group of scientists that have built a model that suddenly proves man-made carbon is the culprit. There are tons of models out there. How can we be so sure they're right?
There's 2 things to examine here: the incentives behind these models and how they're actually being developed.
In the 1990s, countries around the world invested tens of billions of dollars in global warming related research. Most of that budget has gone toward building climate models.
Scientists are constantly competing for funds from the government, but from the 1990s onward, it became incredibly easy, if not required, to mention global warming in order to be granted funding.
So, which government agencies fund research grants?
EPA and NOAA are among some of the organizations that have been funding research on anthropomorphic global warming.
Those research funds come from taxpayers' dollars, and according to Capital Research Center's Dr. Stephen J. Allen, from 1993 to 2014, total U.S. expenditures on climate change amounted to more than $166 billion in 2012.
That's just insane. That's comparable to what the US government has spent on the Apollo program.
It might make more sense for some scientists to just spend some time on global warming research than on subjects that they might find more critical to the environment.
Dr. Roy Spencer, the weather satellite team leader at NASA, says climate models are as good as the assumptions that go into them, and they have hundreds of assumptions. All it takes is one assumption to be wrong to be way off.
Take this with a grain of salt, and no offense to people in the meteorology field, but if our local weathermen can't even get our own weather reports 100% accurate 100% of the time, how can we be so confident that the climate will be disastrous a decade from now?
Right. Professor Ian Clark hits the nail on the head. Claiming that one small factor affects the climate change in a huge way is actually illogical. It shows that these scientists have failed to understand the climate system, the cosmic rays, the solar rays, the CO2, the water vapor, the clouds. If your model doesn't have that, it's not worth anything.
Judith Curry, American climatologist from the Georgia Institute of Technology, detailed in her report, Climate Models for Laymen, how climate models are useful to understand the climate system, but not fit for attributing the causes of recent warming or for predicting global or regional climate change on timescales of decades to centuries.
Curry provided many solid concerns that refute the accuracy of these models, and chief among them is how the climate models failed to provide a consistent explanation of the warming and cooling during the early 20th century.
As we understand it, it's intellectually dishonest of the climate models to use the same observations to tune the climate model.
Next, we'll look at which organizations are behind this huge climate change push.
First, the UN plays a huge role in all of this. In 1988, Margaret Thatcher told Dr. John Houghton, head of the UK Met Office at the time, to set up a climate modeling unit called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC.
They came up with the first big report in 1990 that claimed that CO2, a greenhouse gas, contributed to more than 50% of the enhanced greenhouse effect.
Professor Philip Scott plainly states that the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, like any UN body, is political. The final conclusions are politically driven.
In 2015, the Obama administration introduced the Clean Power Plan to combat anthropogenic climate change and global warming.
One interesting thing to note is the Obama administration approved press releases related to climate change within days, and why does it take more than 6 months under the Trump administration?
It also doesn't take long to see which environmental lobbying groups fund political campaigns. Quote, the top 10 recipients of environmental special interest cash from 2000 to 2004 include John Kerry, Al Gore, and Barack Obama.
The Paris Agreement builds upon the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate and Change, UNFCCC, and was signed by 195 countries in 2015. Its goal is to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change by minimizing global temperature rise.
Again, this agreement comes from an approach that humans are the cause of climate change and we can fix it.
In a 2017 climate science hearing, Judith Curry lays it bare for Congress to witness. Climate science has not progressed due to domestic and international institutions stifling any debate or disagreement.
Curry noted that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change elevated a scientific hypothesis on human-caused climate change to a ruling theory through claims of a consensus.
This scientific debate around climate change had turned into a political battle. Instead of a debate, you have scientists silencing anyone going against the ruling theory.
And it's further perpetuated by the news which zealously and overtly side with the ruling theory of anthropogenic global warming.
Many media outlets simply interviewed politicians like Al Gore and Arnold Schwarzenegger endorsing a view where human-caused global warming was a threat, while publicly dismissing scientists whose findings don't fit within the consensus and still claiming to be unbiased.
They also parrot the same climate change myths like thawing ice caps, malaria spreading, mosquitoes not thriving in the cold, rising sea levels, and carbon's negative effects on the planet.
This political and social climate has allowed media to sacrifice their journalistic integrity and bow down to environmental lobbyists and alarmist politicians.
To summarize, we have this 30-year-old movement born out of a hypothesis from the UN. Really, it's been disproven by so many scientists as evidenced in this episode and beyond. It's a shell of a movement.
It's propped up by politicians all around the globe, backed up by environmental nonprofits and lobbying groups, which in turn push policies that use taxpayer money to fund research to build a falsified consensus.
Mainstream media finds it profitable and convenient to further the alarmist anthropogenic global warming theory and not upset a pre-wired populace.
But what for? Tune into the next episode where we uncover the dark agenda behind it all.
And with that, we'll see you guys out
on the edge.
God dang it, I was a kid in grade school back in the 70s, and they told me up in 1999 there wasn't going to be a goddamn tree left on this planet. It'd be nothing but freaking wind and sand and wearing oxygen masks, man. What happened? They was wrong. They was wrong again. They was wrong before that. They was wrong after that, and they're still wrong, but something's going on. Something's going on. I know something's going on.